Today, I want to assure you that loving someone is the best thing you can ever do. And if that person loves you back, then you're the luckiest person in the world. In my little time on earth, I have seen people fall in love, and only death could separate them. So whenever you see a love story that doesn't end with roses, never allow it be a metric by which you measure the power and beauty of love. If you have found love, then congratulations to you. But if you haven't found it yet, then do not worry. Sooner or later, you will find it, a genuine one at that. And for every broken heart listening to my voice, I pray that God Almighty, who is love personified, fills your heart with abundance as love and sends someone who will love you endlessly your way. If you agree with me on this prayer, then go ahead and type amen in the comment section. Now, let's go into the story of today. The evening sky was a soft canvas of pastel hues as the last traces of sunlight kissed the edges of the Baldwin estate, a mansion perched atop the hills of Los Angeles. The grandiose structure, with its sharp lines and sprawling glass windows, seemed to tower over the city below, a symbol of Jimmy Baldwin's hard-earned success. The landscape gardens surrounding the estate were meticulous, each shrub and flower arranged with precision, reflecting the order and control that Jimmy had cultivated in his professional life. It was an image of perfection, an outward display of a life that many would envy. Yet, inside these walls, a storm was quietly brewing. The Baldwin family sat together at the dinner table, an image of contentment that could easily be mistaken for true happiness. Samantha Baldwin, elegant and poised, served the last dish, a roasted chicken with a side of freshly steamed vegetables. She smiled as her son, Elijah, shared an amusing story from school, his laughter filling the room like music. Jimmy, her husband of nearly 10 years, smiled too, though his smile was distant, as if his mind were elsewhere. His gaze flickered towards a phone resting on the table beside his wine glass, the screen lighting up with every new notification. He picked it up, his thumb scrolling absent-mindedly, but he did not respond to the messages. Samantha noticed a subtle shift in his attention, but chose not to address it. Not tonight. The weight of the moment hung in the air. Beneath the perfect facade, there was an undeniable sense of disconnect. Samantha had long felt the change, like a shadow that followed them, growing longer and more pronounced with each passing day. Jimmy had become distant, preoccupied with something or someone that wasn't her, and though she tried to ignore it, there was no denying the subtle shift in their marriage. Jimmy set his phone down, though he didn't look at Samantha. Instead, he picked up his glass of red wine and took a slow sip, his eyes lost in thought. Samantha's gaze softened as she looked at him. The man she had married was still there, somewhere beneath the surface, the man who had wooed her with his charm, his ambition, and his undeniable allure. But that man seemed to be slipping further away with each passing day. "Are you okay?" Samantha asked, her voice laced with concern. Jimmy's gaze snapped back to her, as though startled by her question. His smile returned, albeit a little forced. "Yeah, just thinking about work. You know how it is." Samantha nodded, not fully convinced. She had heard this excuse too many times to believe it, but she said nothing more, choosing instead to focus on Elijah, who was now asking about their weekend plans. She had been trying so hard to hold on to the life they had built, this picture-perfect family. But she knew something was wrong. She could feel it deep in her gut. Later that night, as the house settled into a quiet stillness, Samantha stood by the kitchen window, staring out into the night. The city lights twinkled below, the hum of life still pulsing in the distance. But in this moment, all she could hear was the sound of her own thoughts, thoughts that refused to be silenced. Jimmy's behavior had been growing increasingly erratic. He had become secretive, always on his phone, always working late. She had tried to dismiss it, telling herself that he was simply focused on his business. But now, as she stood there, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. She jumped when she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. Turning, she found Jimmy standing in the doorway of the kitchen, his face still shadowed by the light from the hallway. There was an almost imperceptible hesitation in his movements, a subtle unease that sent a chill down her spine. "Is everything all right?" she asked softly, her heart pounding in her chest. Jimmy's eyes met hers, but there was something distant in his gaze. He opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated, as if unsure of what to say. Finally, he spoke, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "Everything's fine. Just a lot on my mind. You know how it is." Samantha forced a smile, though the worry gnawed at her. She had been trying to be patient, to understand the pressures he faced as a CEO, the sacrifices they had both made for his career. But tonight, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away from her, a feeling she couldn't ignore anymore. The next day, the clouds hung low over Los Angeles, casting a gray pall over the city as the rain began to fall in steady, rhythmic sheets. Inside Baldwin Enterprises, the sleek, modern building that housed Jimmy's empire, the atmosphere was just as cold and sterile as the weather outside. Jimmy stood in his office, looking out over the city skyline, his thoughts far from the meeting that was about to begin. He had always prided himself on being in control of his company, of his life. But lately, things felt different. The weight of his secret was beginning to take its toll, and the excitement he once felt about his success seemed to fade into the background, overshadowed by a growing sense of guilt. His assistant, Betty, knocked lightly on the door before entering. She was stunning, tall, with sleek black hair and a piercing gaze that always seemed to cut straight through him. She had been working for him for over a year, and over that time, he had found himself drawn to her in ways he had never expected. "Mr. Baldwin," she said, her voice smooth and confident, "the files for the 3 p.m. meeting are ready. I also have the schedule for tomorrow." Jimmy nodded absently, turning from the window. He was about to respond when he noticed her standing there, just a little too close, her perfume filling the air around him, her lips curved into a playful, knowing smile. It was the same smile that had begun to invade his thoughts whenever they were alone. "Thank you, Betty," he said, his voice low. "You've been a great help." Her smile deepened, and there was a flash of something more in her eyes, something dangerous, something he couldn't ignore. As she handed him the files, her fingers brushed against his hand. The contact sent a spark of electricity through him, and for a brief moment, he was paralyzed. Betty lingered for just a second longer than necessary, her body language unmistakably flirtatious. Her gaze locked onto his, and Jimmy felt a pulse of attraction, despite himself. He couldn't help it. It was as if the air between them crackled with an undeniable tension. "You're welcome, Mr. Baldwin," she said, her voice laced with subtle seduction. "I'll be in the other room if you need anything else." As she left the room, Jimmy exhaled sharply, trying to shake the thoughts that had begun to swirl in his mind. He knew he was playing with fire, but something about Betty's presence was irresistible. And now, as he sat at his desk, the sound of the rain tapping against the windows, he couldn't help but wonder just how far he would let himself fall into this dangerous game. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets of Los Angeles wet but gleaming under the midday sun. The city seemed to exhale, its usual hum of activity slowing for a brief moment, as though everyone was taking a collective breath. But in the glossy halls of Baldwin Enterprises, there was no pause. The day marched on at the same relentless pace, the same hum of phones ringing and conversations blending into a constant murmur. Inside Jimmy Baldwin's office, a tension hung in the air that had nothing to do with business. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his eyes focused on the bustling city below, but his thoughts were miles away. He had been unable to shake the feeling that something was changing. The last few weeks had felt like a slow, inevitable descent into temptation, and standing in front of him, at that very moment, was the source of his growing restlessness. Betty, she stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the bright light streaming through the open blinds. Her gaze was steady, almost predatory, as though she could sense the shift in the air between them. Betty had always been confident, but today there was something different about her. There was a coolness in her demeanor, a knowing smile on her lips that suggested she was in control, even if Jimmy didn't fully understand it yet. "Mr. Baldwin," Betty said, her voice smooth like velvet, as she stepped inside the office, closing the door behind her with a soft click. "I wanted to go over the new marketing plan for next quarter." Jimmy's response was automatic, a reflex born from years of business practice. He turned from the window and gestured toward the desk, where he had left the marketing plan from earlier that day. "Sure, let's take a look." But as she walked toward the desk, Her presence seemed to shift the very atmosphere of the room. Every step she took was purposeful, and the tight pencil skirt she wore accentuated the curves of her body in a way that made Jimmy's pulse quicken, despite himself. Betty reached the desk and placed a marketing report in front of him, her fingers brushing against his as she slid it toward him. It wasn't the first time her touch had lingered, but today there was a different energy. Her movements were slower, more deliberate, and when she leaned over the desk to point at a section of the plan, she was just close enough for him to feel the heat of her body. She smelled like jasmine and citrus, and the scent seemed to envelop him, clouding his thoughts. "Jimmy," she said, her voice lowering in a tone that had no place in a business meeting. "You've been distracted lately. Something's been on your mind, hasn't it?" The casual use of his first name startled him, but Jimmy quickly masked his surprise with a smile. "It's nothing, Betty. Just a lot going on." But Betty wasn't convinced. She stepped closer, her eyes locked onto his, and there was a daring glint in her gaze. "You don't have to pretend with me," she said softly. "I know what's going on. I've seen the way you've been looking at me. I've felt it." Jimmy froze, the words hanging in the air. He opened his mouth to speak, but couldn't find the words. It was as though the world around him had blurred, and all that existed was Betty's proximity, her presence. "You're just so caught up in everything else," Betty continued, her voice low and sultry. "But I can see through it, Jimmy. I know what you need." Her words were like a spell, slowly unraveling the restraint that had held him back. Jimmy felt an undeniable pull toward her, a gravitational force that seemed to come from every inch of her body. He knew this was dangerous, knew that this was a line he shouldn't cross. But as Betty leaned in closer, her lips inches from his ear, it all felt like an inevitability. "You need to relax," she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. "Let go, just for once." Before he could react, Betty placed a hand on his shoulder, her fingers trailing lightly down his arm. The touch was electric, sending a shiver through his body. Her lips hovered just a fraction of an inch from his, and Jimmy felt his heart race in his chest. This was no longer just about business. This was about something deeper, something darker. Betty took a step back, her eyes never leaving his. "I'll leave you to think about it," she said, her voice now thick with a layer of unspoken promise. "But I'll be here when you're ready, Jimmy." As she turned to walk away, Jimmy's mind raced. The room seemed to shrink, and all he could focus on was a feeling of her touch still lingering on his skin. But before she reached the door, she glanced back at him over her shoulder, a playful smile curling at the corners of her lips. "Don't keep me waiting too long," she teased, her words carrying the weight of a challenge. Jimmy stood frozen, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He had never felt so conflicted in his life. He was married to Samantha, the woman he had promised a love for better or worse. But standing in front of him was Betty, and the chemistry between them was undeniable. And the worst part? Jimmy didn't want to fight it anymore. The next morning, the rain had passed, leaving the city bathed in sunlight, but the weight of the events in the day before hung over Jimmy like a dark cloud. He had tried to push the memory of Betty's touch to the back of his mind, but it lingered, like a phantom that refused to be banished. At the breakfast table, Samantha noticed a subtle shift in him. He was quieter than usual, his gaze distant. She tried to spark a conversation, asking about his day ahead, but Jimmy's answers were short, distracted. "I'll be home late tonight," he said abruptly, standing up to leave. Samantha looked up, concern furrowing her brow. "Late again? Is everything okay?" "Just work," Jimmy replied, his voice flat, dismissing the question with a wave of his hand. "I'll see you later." And with that, he was gone. Later that day, Jimmy found himself in his office again, staring at the empty chair across from him. He had a meeting scheduled with Betty, but it wasn't the usual business talk that was on his mind. The air between them was charged now, like a wire stretched too thin, ready to snap at any moment. Jimmy knew that when Betty entered, nothing would be the same. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of Jimmy Baldwin's office, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floor. It was a crisp, clear day in Los Angeles, but the weather outside did little to match the storm inside Jimmy's mind. The events of yesterday had only solidified what he'd already known deep down. The affair with Betty was no longer a fleeting moment, a brief lapse in judgment. It was something much more dangerous, something that had taken root in his soul and wasn't easily going to be eradicated. He sat at his desk, absent-mindedly flipping through a report on company performance, though the numbers on the pages blurred before his eyes. His mind kept returning to Betty, to the way she had touched him, the way she had made him feel alive in a way he hadn't experienced in years. He had tried to ignore the attraction, tried to tell himself it was just a fling, a simple lapse in loyalty. But it wasn't. Not anymore. The office door clicked open, and Jimmy looked up to find Betty standing in the doorway, her presence filling the room like a cloud of perfume. Her heels clicked on the floor as she walked toward him, and the air between them seemed to crackle with a charged intensity. Jimmy's heart raced, and despite his attempts to remain composed, he could feel the heat rising in his chest. "Morning, Jimmy," Betty said, her voice smooth as velvet, the playful glint in her eyes unmistakable. "I thought we could go over the project for next week, but if you're too busy, I understand." She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her, a deliberate move that sent a shiver of anticipation through Jimmy's spine. He stood up, his eyes never leaving hers, and he suddenly felt a sense of urgency. It was as though the floodgates had opened, and he no longer had the willpower to close them. "I think we should go over it," Jimmy said, his voice low and steady, though his pulse was anything but. He gestured to the seat across from his desk, but Betty didn't sit. Instead, she approached him slowly, her movements measured and deliberate. "Actually," she said, her lips curling into a smile, "I think we need to discuss something else first." Jimmy raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Betty didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped even closer, closing the distance between them, until there was barely a foot separating them. She leaned in slightly, her breath warm against his ear as she whispered, "You've been holding back, Jimmy. I can see it in your eyes. You want me, don't you?" A chill ran down his spine. He had been fighting it. Fighting the urge to give in, to let his desires take control. But now, with her standing so close, so confident, the battle seemed almost futile. Jimmy could feel the weight of her words settling into his chest, like a poison that was beginning to spread. She was right. He did want her. The question was whether he could walk away from it before it was too late. "Betty," he said, his voice strained, "this isn't a good idea." But even as he said it, Jimmy knew the words held no conviction. His body, his heart, his mind, everything was pulling him toward her. The line between right and wrong was becoming increasingly blurred, and all he could think about was the way she made him feel, the way she lit a fire inside him that he hadn't felt in years. Betty's smile widened. "It's already too late, Jimmy. We both know it." Before he could protest, she reached up, her hand resting on his chest, and gently pushed him back into his chair. The movement was slow, calculated, as though she were savoring every moment of this power she had over him. And as Jimmy sank into the chair, he didn't resist. He couldn't. His heart raced in his chest, a mix of guilt and desire pooling in his stomach. But he couldn't look away from her. Betty knelt down in front of him, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his breath catch in his throat. "You've been so good at pretending, Jimmy. Pretending that everything's fine, that your life is perfect. But I see through it all. I see the man who's hungry for something more." She placed a hand on his knee, her fingers sliding gently up his thigh. The touch was so soft, so delicate, yet it set his entire body on fire. He clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to respond. But it was impossible. Every inch of him wanted this, wanted her, and as she inched closer, the restraint he'd been holding on to snapped. Without another word, he grabbed her by the shoulders and pulled her into a kiss. It was raw, urgent, everything they had been holding back. Betty responded immediately, her lips parting as she gave herself over to him fully. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. It was as though the last piece of the puzzle had clicked into place, and nothing mattered anymore. Their kiss deepened, and Jimmy's hands found their way to her waist, pulling her closer. His body was on fire, every nerve alight with the electricity of their contact. But as he ran his hands along her body, a sliver of guilt crept in, flickering in the back of his mind. He had a wife, a family, but in this moment, none of it seemed real. None of it seemed to matter. Betty broke the kiss, her breath shallow as she pulled back slightly, her eyes sparkling with triumph. "You don't have to fight it anymore," she said, her voice almost a purr. "You've crossed the line, Jimmy, and now there's no going back." Jimmy's chest rose and fell with each breath, his mind spinning. He had known this was coming, had known the moment he let himself become drawn to her, that he was crossing into dangerous territory. But in the face of her seductive power, in the grip of the passion that consumed him, all his reservations seemed meaningless. Betty stood up, brushing a hand through her hair, and then turned toward the door. "I'll leave you to think about it," she said casually. "But I think we both know what's inevitable." As she walked out of the office, Jimmy sat back in his chair, his hands still trembling. His mind was a whirlwind, the weight of what he had just done sinking in. He had crossed the line. There was no denying it now. And though a small part of him tried to resist, he knew deep down that Betty had already won. The affair was no longer a mistake. It had become something much more. Later that evening, as Jimmy returned home, the familiar smell of dinner cooking filled the air, but there was an unfamiliar weight pressing down on him. Samantha was in the kitchen, her back turned as she hummed softly, preparing the meal for their family. She looked the same as she always did, graceful and beautiful. But to Jimmy, she felt like a stranger. As he entered the kitchen, Samantha looked up, her smile faltering slightly as she took his appearance, disheveled, distant. For a brief moment, Jimmy wondered if she knew, if she could sense what he had done, what he had become. But he quickly pushed the thought away. "Hey," he said, his voice strained but trying to sound normal. "Long day." Samantha nodded, her smile returning, but there was a quiet sadness in her eyes that Jimmy couldn't ignore. "I was just thinking about how nice it would be if we could spend some time together. Jimmy, it's been a while." Jimmy opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. All he could do was nod, his chest tightening with guilt. But even as he stood there, trying to piece together the right words, he knew that something had irrevocably changed. Not just between him and Betty, but between him and Samantha. He had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. The days had blurred together in a whirlwind of secret meetings, stolen moments, and quiet guilt. But even as Jimmy Baldwin threw himself into his work, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy, he knew things could no longer stay the way they were. His marriage to Samantha, the life they had built, was slowly slipping through his fingers like sand in the wind. And the worst part? He didn't know how to stop it. The sky outside was overcast, casting a muted gray hue over the sprawling city of Los Angeles. A gentle drizzle tapped against the windows of Baldwin Enterprises, the rhythm of the rain almost mocking the storm that raged within Jimmy. As he sat in his office, reviewing a stack of paperwork, his thoughts kept drifting back to Betty. She had consumed him completely, her seductive charm entwined with every waking moment. He couldn't escape her, didn't want, but the guilt, oh, the guilt was suffocating. Jimmy had been toying with fire for too long, and the consequences were beginning to show. Every time he looked at Samantha, every time she smiled at him, his chest tightened with regret. He had betrayed her, betrayed the woman who had stood by his side for years, who had given him everything, only to be left in the dark while he indulged in his own selfish desires. "Mr. Baldwin?" Betty's voice broke through his thoughts, her soft knock on the door announcing her arrival. Jimmy looked up to see her standing in the doorway, her eyes glinting with the same knowing look that had been etched into his mind for weeks. She wore a fitted red dress today, a color that only seemed to heighten her natural allure. As she stepped into the room, he could feel the familiar pull, the weight of her presence crashing over him. "Betty," he said, his voice strained, "what can I do for you?" She closed the door behind her, walking toward him with the slow, deliberate steps of someone who knew they had control. "I was just wondering if you had a moment," she said, a playful glint in her eyes. "I've been thinking about us." The words hung in the air like a promise, one that sent a shiver down his spine. Jimmy swallowed hard, tried to regain some semblance of control. "Betty, we can't keep doing this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She raised an eyebrow, a smirk curling at the corner of her lips. "Can't we?" she replied. "You don't really mean that, Jimmy. Not after everything." Jimmy stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back. He felt trapped, cornered by his own desires, by the tangled web he had spun. "I'm married," he muttered, as though the words could somehow undo the damage. "I have a family." Betty's gaze softened for just a moment, but there was no sympathy in her eyes. "I know, and I'm sure Samantha will be thrilled to know that you're spending your late nights with me instead of her." The mention of Samantha's name made something inside him shift. Anger, frustration, fear, but also the sharp edge of realization. He had been living a lie, all while Samantha had no idea that the man she trusted was no longer the same. Betty stepped closer, her fingers lightly grazing his arm. The touch was like an electric shock, and for a moment, all the words he had meant to say faded away. "You're not happy, Jimmy. I can see it in your eyes. And deep down, you know you've been waiting for someone to pull you out of a rut you're in. I'm the one who can do that." Jimmy closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling with each breath. "This has to stop," he said, though the words fell hollow. "It's wrong. It's destroying everything. But it's not just me, is it?" Betty's voice was low and coaxing. "You've been chasing this, Jimmy. Chasing the excitement, the passion that you've been missing. I've just given you permission to take it." The weight of her words settled in his gut. There was truth in them, undeniable truth. This wasn't just a fling. This was something that had consumed him, had taken over his every thought, his every action. The house was quiet when Jimmy finally returned home. The smell of roasted chicken filled the air, mixing with the faint aroma of fresh flowers Samantha had arranged on the dining table. There was a warmth to the house that contrasted sharply with the cold, calculating environment of his office. But as he stepped inside, he felt nothing but a growing heaviness in his chest. Samantha was in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she prepared their meal. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up with a soft smile that made Jimmy feel even worse than he already did. "Hey, you're home early," she said, her voice warm, as she moved toward him to give him a quick kiss on the cheek. "I thought you'd be working late tonight." Jimmy froze, his chest tightening as a familiar ache of guilt wrapped around him. He didn't deserve her. He hadn't deserved her for a long time. The easy smile he had once given her now felt like a lie. "Yeah," he said, trying to sound normal. "I decided to cut it short. Thought I'd spend some time with you." Samantha smiled at him, but there was something behind her eyes, something Jimmy couldn't quite place. It was a quiet concern, a nagging feeling that she had picked up on the subtle changes in his behavior. They sat down to eat, and the conversation flowed, though it felt distant. Jimmy was no longer sure how to talk to her without feeling like he was hiding something, or worse, lying. Every word felt rehearsed, every smile forced. He could feel the distance between them, not just from the affair, but from the unspoken tension that hung in the air like a thick fog. "So," Samantha said, breaking the silence, "how was your day?" Jimmy paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. He knew what she was asking, but he didn't know how to answer. The truth was, his day had been consumed by thoughts of Betty, by the affair that had already begun to unravel his life. And no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape it. "It was fine," he muttered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Busy. Same old, same old." Samantha nodded, though her eyes lingered on him with curiosity that felt invasive. "You've been working a lot lately. I've noticed. Everything okay?" Jimmy's heart skipped a beat. She was getting closer, sensing that something was off, and he had no idea how to stop the inevitable fallout that was coming. "I'm just trying to stay ahead," he said, putting on a smile. "You know how it is." But Samantha wasn't convinced. She didn't push any further, but the silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken questions. The next few days were a blur of increasing tension. Jimmy continued to divide his time between the office and his family, but the strain of living a double life was starting to show. He could feel the cracks in his marriage growing wider, and every interaction with Betty seemed to pull him further away from the man he used to be. Samantha, for her part, grew quieter, more introspective. She seemed to sense that something was wrong, but couldn't put her finger on it. The love they had once shared was still there, but it felt distant, like a faint memory fading with time. And all the while, Jimmy found himself caught in a storm of his own making, with no clear path to redemption. The days that followed were a blur, a chaotic rush of meetings, calls, and fleeting moments of silence. But amidst the hustle of a professional life, Jimmy Baldwin couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that everything was falling apart. The affair with Betty had become more than a brief escape. It had taken root in his soul, twisting his emotions into a tangled mess of desire, guilt, and confusion. It was a Thursday afternoon when things truly began to shift. Jimmy sat at his desk, his phone buzzing relentlessly with messages from Betty. Each one seemed more desperate than the last, as if she could sense his hesitation, his inner conflict. The door to his office was closed, but even the privacy of his sanctuary couldn't provide the peace he so desperately craved. Every glance at the screen reminded him of what he had become, what he was losing. Betty's last message read, "I can't stop thinking about you. I need you, Jimmy." He stared at the words for far too long, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, unsure of how to respond. The message lingered in his mind, weaving itself into his thoughts like a haunting melody. "I need you, Jimmy." The words echoed in his head as if they held the key to something dangerous. With a sigh, Jimmy tossed the phone aside, standing up to pace the room. The walls felt like they were closing in on him. He glanced out the window at the sprawling city below, but the view seemed distant, irrelevant. All he could think about was Betty, the way her touch lingered on his skin, the intoxicating pull she had over him. He couldn't escape her, didn't want to, but the guilt, the guilt was suffocating. When Jimmy arrived home that evening, the house felt emptier than ever before. Samantha was sitting at the kitchen table, her back to him as she prepared their dinner. The scent of garlic and herbs filled the air, and for a moment, it was as if everything was normal. Everything was fine, but it wasn't fine. "Hey," Jimmy said, his voice too quiet as he stepped into the room. Samantha turned around, offering the smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She had noticed the distance in him, the coldness that had crept into his demeanor over the past few weeks. But she didn't say anything. She simply nodded and went back to stirring the pot on the stove. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice calm, almost too calm. "Same old," Jimmy replied, his voice hollow. He moved toward the counter, reaching for a glass of wine. His hand shook slightly as he poured it, the weight of his own guilt pressing down on him. He couldn't look at her in the eye, not after everything that had happened. Samantha watched him for a moment before speaking again. "You've been different lately," she said, her voice steady but carrying a note of concern. "I can feel it, Jimmy. What's going on?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been avoiding this moment, the moment when Samantha would finally confront him about the changes she had undoubtedly noticed. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? How could he explain the lie that had been eating away at him? "I'm sorry, Samantha," he muttered, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't know what's happening with me. I've just been distracted. It's not you. It's me." Samantha took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. The subtle questions that had lingered in her mind finally pushed through the surface. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and the weariness in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. "You're shutting me out, Jimmy, and I don't know why." The silence that followed was deafening. Jimmy stood there, frozen, unable to find the words that could fix everything. He wanted to tell her the truth. He wanted to tell her about Betty, about the affair, about the betrayal. But how could he? How could he destroy everything they had built? The thought of it twisted in his chest, suffocating him. "I'm sorry," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what else to say." Later that afternoon, as Samantha sat in her car, parked on a quiet street outside the house, she found herself staring blankly at her phone. She had been avoiding Jimmy's calls and messages all day, trying to sort through the chaos in her mind, but something compelled her to check her inbox. And when she did, she saw the name that made her blood run cold. Betty? Her hand shook as she opened it. The message was short, but it hit her like a ton of bricks. "I know you're hurting, Samantha, but Jimmy chose me, and you need to let go. He's mine now. Don't waste your time trying to fix what can't be fixed." Samantha stared at the words, her heart pounding in her chest. 1,000 emotions surged through her. Anger, disbelief, hurt. She had known about Betty, of course. But reading her words, the possessive, taunting tone, only deepened the wound. Mine now, she repeated softly to herself, the sting of it sinking in. Jimmy had already made his choice. He had chosen her over everything else, over the life they had built, over their family, and Betty was rubbing it in, as if to claim victory over the woman who had been discarded. Samantha's grip on her phone tightened, and before she could stop herself, she threw it against the passenger seat. The sound of it hitting the leather echoed in the silence of the car, but it didn't help. Nothing would help. There was no escaping the reality that she had lost. Lost her husband, lost her trust, and now, it seemed, lost the life she thought she would always have. She slammed her fist against the steering wheel, the tears finally spilling from her eyes as she let out a cry of frustration. She had never imagined her life would come to this, to be abandoned in such a brutal, soul-crushing way. The thought of everything they had worked for now shattered felt like a physical ache, a wound that wouldn't heal. And then, in the quiet of her car, something shifted inside her. She was done. Done with the lies. Done with the pain. She wasn't going to let Betty win. She wasn't going to let Jimmy's betrayal define her. Samantha wiped her eyes, taking a deep breath. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. She was going to take back control of her life, no matter what it took. The silence in the room was suffocating. Samantha stood frozen, her eyes wide as the words Jimmy had just spoken echoed in her mind. Her name's Betty. They reverberated, sharp and unyielding, crashing to the walls of her consciousness like thunder. Jimmy stood across from her, his face a mixture of guilt and shame. His breath was shallow, his body tense, as if he were preparing for a storm that was about to break. But it wasn't the storm outside that frightened him. It was the one he had unleashed within the walls of their home. The betrayal he had tried so hard to keep hidden was now laid bare, and he could no longer escape the consequences of his actions. Samantha's hands trembled as she wiped the tear that had slipped down her cheek. She felt numb, disconnected from the world around her. She had trusted him with everything. And now, it felt like he had taken that trust and ripped it apart, piece by piece. Betty. Samantha's voice was barely above a whisper, as if she couldn't believe the words. You've been seeing her? Behind my back. Jimmy's throat tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He had promised her everything, and now everything was slipping through his fingers. A few months, he said quietly, his voice hoarse. I never meant for it to go this far. Samantha took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. The tears were falling now, uncontrollably, as she tried to process the betrayal. She had trusted him. Foolishly, it seemed. She had built a life with him, given him her heart, and now she was standing in the ruins of it. You never meant for it to go this far. Samantha repeated, her voice breaking. You've been lying to me for months, Jimmy. You've been sneaking around behind my back, sleeping with her, and now you're telling me you didn't mean for it to happen? Jimmy reached out, his hand trembling as he tried to touch her arm, but Samantha pulled away, taking another step back. Don't touch me, she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and heartbreak. I don't even know who you are anymore. Jimmy stood there, helpless, his hands hanging at his sides. He wanted to explain, to make things right, but he knew that there was no easy way to fix this. No words could undo the damage he had done. I never wanted to hurt you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I love you, Samantha. I always have. But I got lost. I let things get out of hand. Samantha turned away from him, wrapping her arms around herself as if to protect herself from the raw pain that was coursing through her. She could feel the walls she had built around their marriage crumbling, each brick falling away with each word Jimmy spoke. Jimmy moved closer, but Samantha raised her hand, stopping him in his tracks. Don't, she whispered, her voice broken. Just don't. I don't know what to say to you anymore. The following days were a blur for Samantha. She moved through the motions of her daily life, but everything felt different. Her world had been turned upside down, and nothing felt familiar anymore. Jimmy was still there, physically present in the house, but emotionally, it was as though he were a stranger. Every glance he sent her way, every apology he uttered, only served to remind her of the betrayal that hung between them like a thick fog. Samantha could no longer look at him without remembering the coldness in his eyes when he confessed. The hurt, the confusion, the utter disbelief. She had tried to process it all, but the truth was too much to bear. She had spent years building a life with Jimmy, investing her love, her trust, her entire being into their marriage. And now, that trust had been shattered. She couldn't even look at their wedding photos without feeling the sting of betrayal. It was early on a Friday morning when she found herself sitting alone in their kitchen, staring blankly at the cup of coffee in front of her. The steam from the hot drink curled upward, and for a moment, she felt as if time had stopped. The quiet of the house seemed louder than ever, the empty space around her echoing with the emptiness inside her. Jimmy had left for work that morning, though neither of them had spoken much since their confrontation. He had apologized, again and again, but Samantha had been too overwhelmed to respond. His words were meaningless now. He had broken something that couldn't be fixed with an apology. She didn't even know what to do anymore. The front door creaked open, and Samantha's heart skipped a beat. She didn't need to turn around to know it was him. She could feel his presence, like a weight in the room, but she didn't look at him. Not yet. She couldn't. "Samantha!" Jimmy's voice broke the silence, hesitant and strained. He had been trying to reach her, but every attempt had been met with cold silence. He hadn't expected her to forgive him overnight, but he had hoped, at the very least, she would speak to him. She remained silent, staring at her coffee. The simple act of looking at it, feeling its warmth seep into her hands, seemed like the only thing she had control over in a world that had spun out of her grasp. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," Jimmy continued, stepping closer to her. "But I need you to know how deeply sorry I am. I don't know what came over me. I never meant for any of this to happen." Samantha's grip tightened on the mug, her fingers turning white. She still hadn't looked at him. "You never meant for it to happen," she repeated quietly. "You never meant for it to happen, but it did. And now I don't know who you are anymore." Jimmy took a step forward, his voice almost pleading. "I love you, Samantha. I always have. And I know I've messed everything up. But I'm asking for a chance. Just one chance to prove to you that I can make this right." She slowly turned her head to face him. Her eyes tired, dark circles beneath them from the sleepless nights and emotional toll of the last few days. "Make it right?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "How can you make this right, Jimmy? How can you make up for the fact that you've lied to me? How can I trust you again?" He opened his mouth to speak, but paused, realizing the weight of her words. There was no easy way to fix this. No amount of apologies, no sweet words could undo the damage that had been done. "I don't know if I can," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I don't know if you can ever forgive me. But I need you to know that I'm sorry, more than I've ever been for anything in my life." Samantha stood up from the table, her legs shaky as she walked toward the door. "I need some time, Jimmy," she said, her voice low and steady. "I need time to think. I can't do this right now." Jimmy nodded, his heart sinking as he watched her leave. He knew he had pushed her to the edge, and now, it seemed as if there was no way back. She didn't even look at him as she walked out, and the sound of the door closing behind her was like the final nail in the coffin. The days after confrontation felt like a slow, aching crawl for Samantha. She had avoided Jimmy as much as possible, taking refuge in corners of their home where he couldn't reach her. She spent most of her time outside, going for walks, visiting friends, or hiding away in a cafe, sipping coffee in silence while her mind raced with thoughts she couldn't escape. But no matter how far she ran, the truth was always there, lurking just behind her thoughts. Jimmy had betrayed her, and that betrayal was something she couldn't simply erase. She had wanted to believe in their love, to believe in a life they had built together, but now that foundation felt cracked, unstable, and irreparable. Samantha knew she had to make a decision. She couldn't keep living in this limbo, caught between what she wanted and what was already broken. She needed to confront her feelings and decide what was best for her. Was there a way forward with Jimmy, or had everything already been destroyed beyond repair? The phone in her hand buzzed as she sat at the cafe, staring out at the bustling street. She hesitated before unlocking it. It was another message from Jimmy, and part of her had hoped, foolishly, that he would respect her space. But he didn't. The message was simple. Can we talk? I don't want to lose you, Sam. I'm sorry. Please. She stared at the words for a long time, her chest tightening with a mixture of anger and sorrow. He was sorry, yes, but his apology had come too late. The damage had been done. She knew it in her bones. She couldn't just go back to pretending everything was fine. The truth was, she didn't know if she could ever look at him the same way again. Back at the Baldwin house, Jimmy sat alone in the living room, his fingers trembling as he held his phone. He had sent Samantha countless messages, tried to call her repeatedly, but she wouldn't respond. She had withdrawn completely from him, and every time he thought about the damage he had caused, his stomach twisted in knots. He had always prided himself on being in control of his career, his life, his relationships, but now he felt utterly powerless. He had let his own desires lead him down a path that he could never undo, and the woman he had once promised to love had slipped away, no longer the person who trusted him without question. He had broken that trust, and now nothing could fix it. The message he had just sent, the one pleading for her to talk to him, felt like the last desperate attempt to salvage something, anything of what they had. But deep down, Jimmy knew that the words were empty. The betrayal was too deep, and no amount of apologies could erase the pain he had caused her. Samantha had every right to walk away from him. He had failed her in every way imaginable, and now he was paying the price. The following day, Samantha stood in front of the bathroom mirror, her reflection staring back at her with a mixture of resolve and vulnerability. She had spent so long questioning herself, wondering if she could ever forgive Jimmy, if she could ever trust him again. But now, as she looked at herself, really looked at herself, she realized something. She didn't need him to complete her. She didn't need him to define who she was. The thought of walking away from the life she had known was terrifying, yes, but staying in a marriage built on lies and betrayal would be a far worse choice. She had been so consumed by love and loyalty, by the idea of a perfect life with Jimmy, that she had lost sight of herself. But not anymore. She was reclaiming her own power, and that meant facing the truth head-on. She wasn't going to let this define her. She wasn't going to let Jimmy's mistakes dictate her future. Samantha turned away from the mirror, her decision solidifying in her mind. It was time to move forward, whether Jimmy was a part of that future or not. She had to heal, and she had to do it on her own. That evening, when Jimmy arrived home, he found the house eerily quiet. Samantha wasn't sitting at the kitchen table or lounging on the couch as she usually did. The air felt different, colder, as if everything had shifted. The realization hit him like a cold slap. She wasn't here. He walked into the living room and froze. On the coffee table, in front of him, was a letter. His heart dropped as he picked it up, his hands shaking. The envelope was addressed to him in Samantha's neat handwriting. He could feel the weight of it before he even opened it. The tension in his chest grew tighter, like a knot he couldn't untie. With trembling hands, he ripped open the envelope. Jimmy, I've spent the past few days thinking about us, about everything that's happened, and I've come to the painful realization that I can't continue living this way. I can't continue living with the shadow of your betrayal hanging over us, pretending that things will go back to how they were. I need to be honest with myself, and with you, I don't think I can forgive you. Not now, not ever. The trust that was broken is too deep. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way. I need time to heal. I need to figure out who I am without you. I'm not asking for you to leave. I'm asking for space, for both of us to take a step back and figure out what comes next. This isn't the end, Jimmy, but it's the beginning of something different, for both of us. Samantha, the letter trembled in his hands, and as the words sank in, Jimmy's world seemed to collapse around him. She had done it. She had taken the first step, the one he had been too afraid to take. Samantha had chosen herself. He sank into the chair, his face buried in his hands, his chest heaving with emotion. This wasn't the way it was supposed to go. He had never imagined a future without her, without the woman who had stood by him through everything. He had betrayed her trust, and now she was walking away from him. He had ruined everything. The next few days were quiet for Samantha. She focused on herself, On rediscovering who she was without the weight of Jimmy's betrayal hanging over her, she started going to yoga classes, reconnected with old friends, and spent more time doing the things she loved. It wasn't easy, and the pain of what had happened still lingered, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was taking control of her life again. One evening, as she sat on the balcony of her apartment, sipping tea and watching the sunset, a sense of calm settled over her. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in months, she felt hopeful. And that, she realized, was enough. The weeks following Samantha's decision were difficult, but they marked a turning point in her life. She had moved into a small apartment on the edge of the city, a quiet place with clean white walls and large windows that overlooked a park. It wasn't much, but it was hers, free from the reminders of the life she had shared with Jimmy. Samantha threw herself into her work, channeling the pain of the last few weeks into something productive. The more time she spent focusing on her career and the people who truly cared about her, the more the shadow of her marriage began to fade. The emptiness she had once felt was slowly being replaced with a sense of empowerment, of independence. She started going out with friends more, rediscovering the person she had been before Jimmy and before the hurt that had clouded her for so long. But there were moments when she would lie awake in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the past pressing down on her. Even now, months after the confrontation, the ache of betrayal lingered. It wasn't just the affair. It was the lies, the feeling of being replaced, the trust she had placed in Jimmy, shattered without warning. Jimmy, meanwhile, was struggling to pick up the pieces of his life. The house felt cold and empty without Samantha's presence, and the silence in the space where they had once shared everything was deafening. He had tried reaching out to her, phone calls, texts, even a few letters, but she had made it clear that she needed space. She wasn't angry anymore, at least not the way she had been in those first few days. But the distance between them had become an insurmountable barrier, and no amount of apologies could rebuild what he had destroyed. He threw himself into work, trying to drown out the guilt with business meetings and endless paperwork. But the thoughts of Samantha, of the life they had shared, followed him everywhere. He had made a terrible mistake, one that could never be undone. And though part of him had expected Samantha to forgive him, to come back to him after a few months, he had come to realize that things might never be the same. Betty, who had once seemed like the escape from his reality, was no longer a comfort. She had demanded more and more of his time, her possessiveness suffocating him. And now, more than ever, Jimmy realized that Betty had never been the answer to his problems. She had been a distraction, a temporary relief from the pain he had been avoiding. But that relief had come at a cost. As the months passed, Jimmy's life became more and more isolated. He spent long hours in his office, his mind heavy with thoughts of Samantha and the life he had lost. He couldn't fix it. He couldn't fix anything. His marriage was over, and he had no one to blame but himself. One evening, after finishing a dinner with her best friend Maya, Samantha found herself walking back to her apartment in the cool night air, her mind clear. She had been doing better, feeling more at peace with her decisions. Still, the idea of forgiveness, the idea of moving past the hurt, was something she hadn't yet come to terms with. But in that moment, as she walked down the quiet streets, she felt lighter than she had in months. The guilt that had weighed her down, the pain from her marriage, was slowly starting to fade. When she reached her apartment building, she hesitated for a moment before opening the door. She didn't know why she had paused, but something told her she wasn't quite done with the past yet. She placed her keys on the counter and sat down at her small kitchen table, staring out the window into the city below. There was a knock at the door. Samantha stood up slowly, her heart thudding in her chest. She wasn't expecting anyone, not at this hour. When she opened the door, she was surprised to see Jimmy standing there, looking more disheveled than she had ever seen him. His face was gaunt, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and hope. Jimmy began, his voice hoarse. "I'm sorry for showing up like this. I couldn't keep pretending. I need to say something." Samantha stood in the doorway, unsure what to do. She had expected him to come back at some point, but not like this. She didn't want to feel anything for him, but deep down, she knew she wasn't completely free of the emotions that had once tied her to him. Still, she stood her ground. "Jimmy," she said softly, her voice steady, "I don't know if I'm ready to hear anything you have to say." He nodded, taking a slow step forward. "I get that. I know I can't take back what I've done. I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I'm here anyway because I need you to know that I'm truly sorry for everything. What I did to you, it was wrong, and I ruined everything. I don't expect you to take me back. But I needed to tell you that, for once in my life, I see the damage I've caused. I see the person I've become, and it's not someone I want to be." Samantha's heart clenched, and for a moment, she felt the familiar ache. The Jimmy she had once known, the man she had loved, was still there, buried under the layers of his mistakes. But that wasn't enough. He had betrayed her, and the man standing in front of her wasn't the same person who had promised to protect her, to cherish her. He had broken that promise, and no apology could change the fact that everything was different now. "I don't know what to say," Samantha whispered, her voice shaky. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again, Jimmy." He took a step back, his face filled with the sorrow she had expected but never truly wanted to see. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Sam. I just needed you to know I'm sorry for everything, for what I did to you." The silence that followed felt heavier than the words that had just been spoken. Samantha looked at him for a long moment, the pain of the past still raw in her chest. "Goodbye, Jimmy," she finally said, her voice firm but quiet. Jimmy turned and walked away without another word, leaving Samantha standing in the doorway, the weight of everything between them hanging in the air. As the door closed behind him, Samantha felt a strange sense of finality. The ache in her chest remained, but it wasn't as sharp as it had once been. She had taken the first step toward healing, toward reclaiming the life she had lost. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that it was hers to shape. She was no longer defined by her past or by the man who had once been her everything. She was stronger than that, and whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms. Dear friends, this brings us to the end of our story today. But one important lesson we must learn is that love is never enough when it comes to marriage. You need discipline and total commitment to stand up to the oath of fidelity you swore to your partner. As a man, never let anyone appear to be able to give you what your wife is not giving you. If your marriage is taking a deep down, energize it with vacations, time alone, or even going out on dates. This is called being intentional about each other. I pray for you, my dear friends, that our love will never turn sour. What made you happy will never bring you pain and sorrow. You will grow old with that partner you have chosen, and nothing or no one will ever be an instrument of destruction. If you believe in this prayer, then go ahead and type your amen in the comment section. Thank you for being with us today. I, Mr. Steve, is eternal grateful, for without you, I won't be motivated to share these enthralling stories here. You, my dear friends, are my biggest motivation. So once more, please subscribe to my channel, like and share this video to as many people as possible. This is the only way we can keep getting the motivation to bring more amazing stories your way. I love you all so much. See you in the next video, and bye for now.